Okay, welcome everybody to our seminar on equity in the classroom. So this is, we're happy to put this on today and talk a little bit about it. Before we get started, I wanted to briefly introduce the group that nominally organized this, the Faculty Male Advocates and Allies for Equity. So this is a community of male faculty members who hope to learn, ask questions, and have candid discussions, especially candid discussions about departmental cultures and practices, and to raise awareness and work towards equity and inclusion for all faculty at IU. That said, we couldn't do this without the collaboration and help of many others. So on that note, I'm going to pass it off to Dr. Laura Brown, who's one of the original collaborators who put this workshop together. So I'll go to the next slide if I know how to use my arrow keys. And Laura, would you like to take it over briefly?
Sure. So this came about from a collaboration between the Faculty Male Advocates and Allies and CWIT, so the Center of Excellence for Women and Technology. And so I believe Tom James, who's here, kind of started this collaboration with CWIT and recruited people via email, and I signed up, and I don't really remember what the whole process was, but it sounded like a fun project. So what I did here is just went back through all of those group emails over the last year or two to acknowledge the people who gathered the materials and created the slides and put this presentation together. And I've listed them here, and I'm sure I've left some people out, and I apologize in advance for that. I just want to make sure we acknowledge their work, because most of them aren't here for the the final presentation. So. We are very thankful for everything they did leading up to this.
Great. So yes, thanks to all the input that went to this. And on that note, I think we can jump ahead to the roadmap for today. So the discussion of equity in the classroom, we've broken it down into 4 parts. The first one is about classroom community norms. We'll then move on to the classroom climate. The third part will be universal design for learning, which is something that I learned about in jumping in to help with this, and I'm particularly excited to see. And then finally, part 4 is the actionable steps and takeaways, which I think is a nice way to wrap all of this up. So we're going to start with community norms, and I'll be talking us through this section. So with that, I will introduce myself. My name is Chris Meyer. I am a professor in the physics department. This is my 4th year here at IU, and I jumped into these wonderful workshops maybe 3 years ago, and then about a year ago, they put out a call for people interested in joining, and I thought it sounded like a wonderful thing to do, and of course, in support of a very noble goal for the university. So with that, community norms, I think it makes sense to talk about why, or what are community norms, first of all. Sorry, I'm getting rid of all these little Zoom things in my corner. So what are community norms in the classroom? Well, these are expectations for interacting with each other in the classroom setting. And this is interactions between students and students, between teachers and students, and any other kind of, mix up you might have. So they should account for gender differences, different cultural and communication styles, and also other embodied differences. And these are established when behavior that instructors and students expect becomes routine and consensus. So expecting a community norm does not make it a norm, right? It's when it becomes routine and the consensus that it actually becomes a norm. So why are these important? Well, there's kind of 2 sides of this coin. The first side is, what do they convey messages about? And they convey messages about the role of the instructor and the student. What is the instructor expected to do? And what is the student also expected to do? They convey messages about engagement between everybody in the classroom, about communication and relationship building, as well as things like diversity and intergroup awareness and understanding. So on the other side, they establish the expectations for the culture of the actual classroom, and then how people behave in the classroom. And then finally, the accountability of people in the classroom. So when going about developing these norms, there's a number of things you can think about. And we're going to have a breakout session in a little bit to kind of do a practice session of this ourselves. And I will have pasted these into the Google Doc that I'll share in a second. But some of the tips that you can think about when walking through developing classroom norms in your own classroom. First of all, identify community values. Okay, what are things that are important in the community? And this might be different depending on the given class you're teaching. Second, articulate goals for the classroom. It's important to talk about what you hope students to take away at the end of the semester, and then what kind of norms will help reinforce that goal. You should prioritize the needs, both for the students and for the instructors. What do people need in order to do their best in the class and in order for everybody to succeed? 4 is ensure inclusivity of all groups and identities. We don't want to exclude anybody, either deliberately or not deliberately. 5, consensus versus unanimous. So this is something I had to look up when I was first doing this. Consensus means that nobody disagrees, whereas unanimous means that everybody agrees. And there's that kind of gray area between not necessarily agreeing, but not disagreeing. And so this is why consensus is easier to meet than unanimity. Okay, so the 6th one is to create safe, judgment-free agreements. And then finally, factor in the role of technology. And, you know, as we moved into kind of online teaching, this adds a whole new aspect of technology. There's this kind of chat in the side. What is the use of the chat function? Should people be putting questions in there? Should people be, you know, chit-chatting with each other? There are expectations there that should go into the classroom norms. But even before that, there is communication, you know, in Canvas chats and in emails between students and professors. If you as an instructor expect certain kinds of formalism to be observed when students write you an email, it's important to spell that out. Or if not, then this should be clear. So it's important to factor in the role of technology into how you set up these classroom norms. So I think it helps to go over a couple of examples. So there'll be 3 examples. And then the first one lists 4 norms that were developed for a classroom. The first one is curiosity. The second is candor. The third is courtesy. And then finally, courage. So by curiosity, what that means is we're going to pursue our strong desire to learn together. Okay, we're going to respect each other's curiosity. Candor. We need a level of openness that is not just encouraged, but it's essential and it's expected. Okay, you're expected to be open and honest about what we're talking about in class. Courtesy. This is an acknowledgement that we're having discussions that matter, and we always operate from a place of good intentions, okay? And sometimes that doesn't always come across, but we should be courteous to each other and point out when things, you know, don't quite ring like the person saying them should or not. And finally, courage. We should be willing to listen and understand, because this is how learning happens. And it takes courage to learn and to listen when you don't necessarily know something that you thought you might have. So this is one example of a set of classroom norms that you could put together. Another example that adds a few more include listening, humility, respect, trust, and voice. So by listening, we mean deeply listening to what others say and to the feelings, experience, and wisdom behind what they say. We want to listen to what they're saying and not necessarily just try to springboard off that to something else you want to talk about, right? Humility. It's recognizing that however passionately we hold ideas and opinions ourselves, other people may hold pieces of the puzzle that we don't. Respect is about trusting the integrity of others, believing that they have the right to their opinion. You know, just because we don't agree with it doesn't mean that they are wrong for having that opinion. And we should value others enough to share our ideas and to listen to their ideas. There should be trust in the classroom, building a safe space to explore new ideas and work through conflicts, controversy, and painful moments that may arise when talking about issues of injustice and oppression, okay? And finally, voice. Speaking the truth as we see it and asking questions about things we don't know, particularly related to topics on justice, identity, and power, okay? So that's the second example. And then we'll go through one more example before kind of outlining how we can build these ourselves, and then going into a kind of a practice breakout session where we can do this in this workshop. So the third example is to listen actively and attentively. Share responsibility for including all voices. So this means we do not interrupt one another. And when we challenge each other, we do it in a respectful way. And finally, being open to changing your perspective. So we want to critique ideas, not people. We're not attacking people. We're considering the ideas that are put forth and then judging them on their merits, right? This means we want to avoid put downs, and we want to take responsibility for the quality of the discussion. We want to contribute to the quality of the discussion and not just talk for the sake of being heard. We want to build on one another towards a shared understanding. We want to make sure we don't monopolize the discussion. And we'll come back to this point. As a teacher, sometimes a particular student or students will monopolize the discussion. And this is another thing to be aware of. But If you put it in a community norm, then this is something you can point as when you address a situation that may come up with somebody monopolizing the situation or the discussion. Speaking from your own experience without generalizing, we all have our opinions, and this comes from our own lived experience, but that doesn't mean that it's everybody's experience. Then finally, if we're offended, acknowledge it completely, okay? And then go from there. So these are 3 examples of community norms that you could put together for your classroom and have been put together for classrooms. As far as how you might want to go about doing this for your classroom, a community norm is only a norm when the whole community accepts it, right? So it's important to involve the community in the drafting of it. So that's why the first step is to draft a list from student suggestions. So this is something you can do on the first day of class, talking about your syllabus, or maybe the second day, to set the expectations for the rest of the semester. If you have a large class with hundreds of people, maybe this is something that you do in individual discussion sections. Oftentimes the first discussion section is canceled because there's not something to talk about. This could be something to bring to that first discussion section. Then as a class, highlight the widely agreed upon norms and then mark those that require more discussion so that you can loop around in the next step. And as a class, actually discuss the marked norms and reach a consensus. And remember, consensus here means that there's no disagreement. It does not mean that everybody is wildly in agreement about a given norm. The 4th step is to create a formal list of 6 to 7 norms. You shouldn't be shooting for hundreds of norms in a classroom, but you should try to have 6 to 7 norms or so, something manageable that you can agree upon, gain consensus for as a community. And then once these are drafted, you should share the norms with your students, okay? And this means both sending them out, maybe in a message or an email, discussing them in the next day at class, and in particular, including them in your syllabus. This is really important. And I guess, many students don't read the syllabus, but having it in the syllabus gives it another level of importance, let's say. But it doesn't stop at the beginning of the semester. It's important to periodically loop back and ask if the established norms are working. As students have discussions in their sections, or as you continue to teach, maybe something got overlooked at the beginning, or maybe something doesn't quite hit the point it was trying to hit. And that leads to the final step. You can adjust these as necessary. If something isn't working out, or some issue comes up that you need to address, you can always update the norms, kind of maybe going through this list as a draft, but they don't have to be set in stone from the first day onwards. You can adjust these. And I think as you do this more, you'll find that, the first list is probably less adjustable by the end of the semester, or less adjusted, but it's important to always be able to adjust it as necessary. Okay, so I'm going to pause there and maybe open it up for questions if anybody has them. The next thing will be a professor, actually, Tom, who's part of this session, talking about setting up norms for his classroom, and then we'll go into a breakout session. But before that, are there any questions? Okay. And feel free to raise a hand in Zoom or just unmute at this point. I think there's not too many people.
Hey, Chris, can I ask a quick question?
Yes, please, Josh.
So I guess I'm really intrigued by this whole idea. I've got a colleague in my department who uses this technique and has found some real success with it. And I think I'm eager to give it a shot next time I'm in the classroom. I guess I'm just it's just an observation, I guess. I mean, this strikes me as a really useful technique for engaging in difficult conversations and maybe some delicate or tough content in the class. But I guess it's like eyes wide open that this is this is sort of an artificial construct, in the sense that one of my learning goals in my class is to help practice civil discourse and practice engaging on tough and challenging subject matter around race and gender and how it applies in the business context. I teach business ethics, and we incorporate a lot of these kinds of material. But I guess I've always kind of approached it from the standpoint of, we're practicing so that we can do this in the real world, do this in a corporate organizational setting, or do it in the public square, perhaps, civil discourse, where these norms, are not going to be agreed upon in advance. And so I guess I've never really done this, because I've always thought, well, again, I'm trying to sort of simulate a real world, prepare students for these real world experiences where these won't be in place. But I guess I'm curious your thoughts and maybe the thoughts of others. I guess I'm inclined to give it a shot based on your presentation and my colleagues' success in the classroom, sort of knowing, I guess, that this is like a learning environment. I mean, obviously it's a classroom, and so having these agreed upon norms in place facilitate the learning experience in obvious, in obvious ways that will be different outside of the classroom in other spaces. So I guess it's sort of more of a comment that I would love to hear other feedback on if there is any. But yeah, I'll stop with that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great observation. Certainly classrooms are very different than the real world, right? Because classrooms are just more structured. And I guess I don't claim to be an expert on this, so I'd be curious of other people's opinions too. But my knee-jerk reaction is that this is a training ground for exposing people to what these norms could be, so that they're aware of them, even if they aren't enforced in the real world or anything like that. It opens awareness now, so that when they go out into industry, it's kind of I don't know if trickle down effect is the right idea, but it slowly opens people's eyes, so maybe they notice something and then they can bring it up as a point of discussion with the community, the real world place they are in, and make a difference that way, right? But yeah, I'd be curious if other people have responses to that observation as well.
Hi. So my thought on that is that I agree that currently these things are not usually respected in a lot of real world situations, but especially, like, I don't know much about the course you teach, but the business world, maybe the students in your class who experience this in the classroom can go on to make this more common in business settings, if they're in a manager or like a leading role, and that would be great. So yeah.
I'll also just add that sometimes establishing these norms can help the students that might have a hard time being noticed in class otherwise, right? So especially like the no monopolizing the conversation kind of thing, or basically getting all the voices that that you might not get normally. So it would benefit your students in that way as well.
Yeah, no, thanks, Chris, Ashley, and Laura. Now, I definitely see the payoff and the benefit in the classroom. I'm convinced on that front. I guess what I was just trying to sort of think through and trying to process is in even presenting these to a business school classroom, would I be presenting them as, these are tools, these norms. We're going to use these tools in our classroom to facilitate as inclusive and engaging and constructive experience as possible. And then I guess to your point, Ashley, going forward into whatever organization you go into, you might think about, I'm just curious, do these sorts of agreed upon norms, do they happen in organizational settings outside of classrooms, or is it more sort of internalized that enough people are practiced in observing and recognizing these norms that they begin to sort of, on a more subliminal level, infuse the discourse and make it more, more constructive and more positive and more civil, or is it the fact that, or is it the case that there are practices out there outside of classroom context where these sorts of norms are discussed in advance and agreed upon, like in a boardroom or like in a team meeting in an organization? I'm just curious, does anybody know about how these are used outside of classrooms? That would inform how I can share it with students as a best practice for them going forward.
So I see Simon has raised his hand.
I'm thinking that the example that I would cite is that in instances where we are hiring faculty, our faculty meetings have far greater structure in the discussion of candidates associated with ensuring that everyone's voice is heard. So that is, it's not so much, it's a norm because for those of us who've been on the faculty for a number of years, this is how we present it. But it is the idea of ensuring by asking everyone in the room for their opinions of the candidates based upon the information that they've supplied, followed up with individual structured discussions, and following on the lines of as one would do in an interview, ensuring that there are specific questions about individual candidates that are pertinent and those that are not to be considered. So I think, I mean, in some senses, I see that the community norms extend into expectations for committee meetings in the same way.
I see Ed has his hand raised as well.
Yeah, hi. I guess, Josh, I would say that one of the things that's most challenging, I think, is that these norms evolve and exist whether we articulate them or not. And I think the problem is that in the absence of actually discussing them, we just leave it up to people to sort of decide for themselves what appears to be the norm or what is rewarded in the classroom or not. Because I mean, I think of discussion classes that I have, and you know, if you don't specifically make people talk, a lot of people will be reluctant to do so. But if you make it mandatory, then, you know, what's the nature of that? And how do you respond if, you know, somebody's comment kind of goes off tangent, or, you know, all those different kinds of things. And so just being upfront about it just allows everybody to understand that we're on the same page about things, and that certainly seems to facilitate smoother kind of interactions. And I think that in any work groups that we're in, if we kind of talk about those norms right off the bat, like, you know, I think it just structures interactions to make them more effective. And I think we can all learn from that, because in the absence of that, I think a lot of times there's a lot of mixed opinions about what really is reinforced and rewarded and stuff. And I think that's kind of dangerous.
I see Ashley's hand raised as well.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think a lot of the time when the norms are unspoken, it leaves a lot of room for problems with equity and inclusion. And just being really, you know, explicit about what they are can stave off a lot of that before it starts.
Great. So yeah, I had come into this thinking it as a tool to bring equity to the classroom and kind of streamline the learning process. But it's an interesting and I think an important point that, you know, people take this outside of the classroom when they go to work. So that's it's an interesting conversation. I don't want to cut it short. I think, Ed, your hand is raised because it was, and there's nothing else to say. But we have limited time today. So with that, why don't I push on? We will circulate these slides afterwards. And since we're already running at about 15 minutes into this talk, I would propose that we don't watch this video, since we've had a nice discussion of this, and instead we go to breakout rooms, because I think this is probably going to be more useful, and then you can watch the video afterwards, you know, on your own time. There's a second one as well in these slides. So what I would propose is that we'll make breakout rooms. Last I checked, we had 8 people, 1, 2, 3, 4. So I think we'll make 2, no, or do we have more now? 1, 2, 3, 4. It looks like 9 or 10. So maybe we'll make 3 breakout rooms, and I put together a Google Doc so that each of the breakout rooms can put 1 to 2 classroom norms or norms in general that you come up with. And then also at the top of this doc, I've listed the tips for developing norms, as well as, you know, the list to go through, so we can reference these since the slides won't be visible in the breakout rooms. So let me copy the link over to the chat, and I will set up the breakout rooms now. Okay, it looks like moderators are not automatically put into these. So I'll create 3 rooms, and then us moderators, us hosts, will jump into a room after the fact. So another person should join your room shortly, and we'll encourage you to start the discussion, and we'll meet back here in, let's say, 7 minutes. So 5 minutes after 2 o'clock. Okay, so I think we're all back here. I hope that was the group I was in, I think was quite productive, and it was an enjoyable conversation. I hope the other ones were as well. So I'm sharing the screen for what everybody came up with. And group one came up with respect, treat others the way we want to be treated. Is this the golden rule or the platinum rule? And comments need to be objective rather than subjective. Does anybody from group one want to mention anything else about this? Okay, I think these are very nice. So group two came up with 3 as well. Prompt feedback, kind of the idea that, students should be able to expect quick feedback, but also they shouldn't expect feedback that is too quick. You can't email 5 minutes before an assignment and have it, answered. Listening, and there was some discussion here on whether this is the same or different for larger classes or smaller discussions, where smaller discussions might be talking about things in an evolving discussion, whereas larger classes might be asking for an answer, right? If somebody answers incorrectly, perhaps you should listen and try to address what they might have gotten wrong, as opposed to just ignoring the incorrect answer and jumping in and saying a correct answer if you know it. And then finally, I think one of the ones we all ended up liking the most was the multiple formats for responses are okay. Some people may not be comfortable talking about these things. And as a norm, it's okay if you want to chat and answer at the professor, if it's in Zoom or in Top Hat or something else. Raising your hand and verbally speaking is not the only way to give feedback. And then it looks like group 3 came up. Oh no, anonymous chameleon is blocking things. If you have already spoken once, you don't speak again until everyone who has not had a chance has had a chance. So there's some kind of rotation. And I guess this is for the smaller classes where you're having a discussion. So I think all of these are great. These are great classroom norms. Are there any comments or questions before we move on to the second topic of today? Anything from people from the groups wanted to share that they particularly enjoyed or learned? Okay, in that case, why don't we go on to the next section then, which is classroom climate. And I will stop sharing so I no longer have control.
Oh, what did I? Sorry, I'm just getting the right one to share. So I hope that now this is So I just got a Microsoft error reporting message. So I think my PowerPoint just closed itself. So let's try again. Is that now visible to everyone?
Yes.
Great. Well, I'm Simon Brassel, and I'm a professor in Earth and Atmospheric Sciences, and I've been at IU now for over 30 years. And since I teach about climate change, talking about classroom climate seems particularly pertinent. And so within this section of the session, there are 4 main activities and discussions that one wants to embark on. And the topics focus on, first of all, a sense of belonging and what that constitutes within a classroom. Secondly, the idea of a growth mindset and what that represents, and in particular, leading on to how that can help enhance inclusivity within a classroom. And then we'll have a breakout activity to further consider the nature of building a sense of belonging within a classroom. So this is the roadmap. And so we start with the sense of what the sense of belonging is and its importance, because we need to assist students' integration into the college system. And the more that it's possible to build a student sense of belonging to the university community, there's more commitment that they will have to the institution, to their learning, and the more likely that they will remain in college. So this is both an enhancement of their experience and also a matter of retention. So sense of belonging is a basic human need and motivation. And I was going to mention that there's a document that I will share after the session, which has the resources that are mentioned here with links to them and the various supporting documents. But everyone has a need to belong. And within the context of a school, that is the extent to which students feel respected, accepted, and supported. And it's both by their fellow students, but also by the faculty and by the environment that they experience, especially within the classroom. So the more that it's possible to have students think, feel, and act like they belong within the institution, in the classroom, then all of this helps toward their success. So there are various ways in which the sense of belonging can be assessed, and a number of institutions conduct these surveys, and this is one example of them because it provides an assessment of 4 separate areas for students to comment on. And those are peer support, their comfort within the classroom, whether there are perceptions of their isolation within the community, and also the extent to which they feel that the faculty are supporting their endeavors. And again, a copy of this document is in the handout that will circulate. So from a personal perspective, then that leads to the consideration of the sense of belonging within your individual classroom. Do students feel like they belong? Do you communicate your commitment to individual student success? Do your students know what is expected of them within the class and what success within that class would represent? And do you actively invite your students to communicate both with you and with your peers? All of those components can help build toward this sense of belonging. And so we'll return to that within the activity, but to move to the second part of this considerations about classroom climate, it's now the idea of what constitutes the mindset of students and instructors. And so there's this division that we can identify between a fixed mindset and a growth mindset. And the fixed mindset on the left here represents this idea that what a student brings into a class in terms of their basic qualities, intelligence, are fixed, and that their ultimate success is going to be dependent upon what they bring into the classroom. And that's, in a classroom context, that means that that's the idea of documenting that, assessing those skills rather than developing them. Whereas the growth mindset takes the perspective that abilities can be fostered and developed. And so it focuses much more on creating students learning and especially some resilience to the development of that learning, so that instances where they don't get things right, where they fail particular assignments, that is all part and parcel of this learning process. And the idea that what they bring to the classroom at the beginning is the starting point, and that they have that opportunity for development. And this idea stems from Carol Dweck, and the book is shown here, and there's a paperback version of it as well. And in the context of assessment of this idea between fixed versus growth mindsets, there's been a variety of studies, including this one by STEM faculty within IU. And the outcome from such studies reinforces the importance of establishing a classroom climate that has a growth mindset to it. Because the data from that study show that faculty who have a growth mindset benefit the students more than those who have a fixed mindset. And what is particularly important is that it is the student's perception of that mindset that is necessary for translating these benefits, for them to benefit from the sense that they can develop and grow within a classroom. And in some senses, it's more important for the students to understand and buy into that than it is for the faculty member. Their perception is what is critical in enabling them to be successful. And when we put that into the context of the information that's come from assessing the difference between fixed and growth mindsets, the data here demonstrates the fact that there is an enhancement of students' learning with the growth mindset compared to the fixed mindset, but more especially that the racial achievement gap is narrowed by this growth mindset. And so in a sense, there is a benefit to all students, but the benefit to specific racial groups is the greatest. And that's the other key rationale for why establishing a growth mindset within a classroom context is especially critical. And what that constitutes is then the students perceiving that the focus of the class is on learning and development. So this then leads to the consideration about what about the mindsets within the classes that we teach? And it's a case of recognizing ways in which students may reflect the idea of a fixed mindset with, I can't do this, versus those who may say, I can learn from my mistakes. And so the more that one can emphasize the latter rather than the former and encourage students to have that mindset, the better their opportunity for success. And so part of that within a classroom context is then the consideration of the extent to which the format of the class and the pedagogies that are utilized provide opportunities to learn from failures, to try and continue to try and practice, and therefore have a sense that their knowledge and their learning is being developed within the classroom, so that such opportunities within the class help promote that idea that the class is built around a growth mindset. So there are a variety of questions here that we can summarize to describe the characteristics of what constitutes a growth mindset in a classroom context. And so it's a case of, do students know how to succeed? Are resources for the students to be successful? Is there information to help the students know how they should study and learn in the course, and especially to learn after perhaps they've got specific assignments or answers to questions incorrect? Do the students know how to get help with the class? What resources are available? And then it's reaching out to students who are struggling to provide help and to complement those students who succeed, or especially those students who demonstrate evidence that they are learning and that they're improving their understanding of the course material. Do you highlight successes and remind students of their progress is part of that? And then are there conversations with the students about this concept of fixed versus growth mindset to help them understand how the class is structured to help them learn? And so that idea of the mindset also feeds into the nature of inclusivity within the classroom, and the way in which, in order for a student to have both this sense of belonging and to recognize that they have an opportunity to grow within the class, it's a case of recognizing who's represented in the class and by the class materials. And so evidence of the diversity of a field or of actions within the field where the students can see themselves contributing all helps to build their sense of inclusivity, their sense of belonging, and their sense of an opportunity to grow and develop within the class. And so that again, building this inclusivity helps with all of these elements of the classroom climate. And so this then leads us to the breakout activity, but perhaps before transitioning into exploring these questions and into breakout rooms, let me pause and ask if there are specific questions that it would be helpful to address ahead of this activity. Well, let me then summarize what we would like to do within the small group. There are 3 questions that are here, and I've added them into the Google Doc that, that Chris created. And it focuses then on, first of all, a time when you felt like you did not belong in an educational setting. The second question is how your individual instructors, from what one remembers from past experiences, or alternatively in terms of colleagues, what they've done to create a sense of belonging in the class, and how can you plan to create more inclusive classes for your students. So in a sense, it's a combination of question 1 is a past experiences, 2 is more the present, and 3 is looking to the future. And so I hope that Chris will be able to send us back into the breakout rooms, and we'll look forward to continuing the conversations there.
It looks like I can. So let me click this button, and if we all go there, then it worked.
Hello.
Hello again.
Do you want us to put these on the Google Doc? I forgot what we decided.
Yes, I think the Google Doc, I added the questions in on a separate page after Chris's, so they should, the questions should be there, but I'm not sure, I didn't put the actual group
add that
down there, so that can be added, I think, yeah.
All right. So describe a time when you felt like you did not belong in an educational setting. Anyone want to be brave? Oh, here, let me.
Comments from either of the groups in terms of feedback with regard to these questions before we move on to part 3. So is there aspects of the discussions that individuals would like to share that they found helpful?
Can you all see it, by the way? Okay.
Well, so I'll just speak up and say that group 3, we were very energetically involved in this, even though we didn't really write down very much. But we were talking about a kind of like a specific case study, and it kind of fixated on the idea, if you have a classroom that is highly unrepresentative, so like very disproportionately white and male, how do you effectively moderate those discussions without making the white males who feel like they're a large part of your class kind of get disillusioned with you as a moderator. And I think in the end, we decided that community norms, which we just learned about earlier today, might be a way to do that, because you kind of, you that's their agreement that they are going to listen to other people's voices and things like that. So that's kind of what we came up with.
Thank you. Anyone from group 1 or 2 like to speak to the discussions there?
I had something I just realized I wish I had added to the third part. I was in group 2, but how would we plan to make our classes more inclusive? One idea might be to give like a survey after the course asking students how their experience was and if there's anything that they would recommend changing in the future to improve inclusivity, and then see if you can apply any of those ideas.
Thank you. I don't know whether Laura or Phoebe, you'd like to mention anything of our discussions in group 1.
Well, I'll say that our third thing is kind of so we said to approach each course revision with an enlightened mindset. This were Simon's words, and I liked them. So what can we do this time to make it more inclusive? And always have that question in mind and always try to do better. And I think that everyone here is doing exactly that, right? You're all here trying to look for things to do that would make your class better. So you're on step 3.
Thank you. I think let's move on and to the third part. And so Laura, I'll pass this over to you. Thank you.
Okay. So my section is on accessibility and as a part of inclusivity. And I'm going to just kind of go over the basic concepts of universal design for learning. And I'll have the major caveat here that I'm not an expert on this. I don't do it well, if at all, right? But it's aspirational for me, and this has been a learning process for me as well, okay? Okay, so we'll start with some definitions. So what is universal design for learning? And it's a set of design principles, so this is like course design principles, meant to guide educators in reducing learning barriers for our students. So some of the barriers that our students face are very visible, right? If you see a student in a cast on crutches, you know you have to make accommodations for that student, right? It's very clear. But not all of these barriers are visible, right? So for example, sensory disabilities, reading difficulties, language barriers, that's a common one here. We have a lot of international students. Emotional challenges, sociocultural differences, issues with executive function, etc. So these are all things that you can't see just by looking at someone, right? You can't make assumptions about any of these barriers. So UDL exists as to help these students specifically, but just like the growth mindset study that you saw earlier, implementing these design features raises up everybody. Okay, so it reduces gaps, in this case with the students with these particular barriers, but it lifts everybody up. Okay, and I should also, this was taken from here, so University of Buffalo has a nice overview from their teaching center. Okay, so so how does it work? All right, so the way that people think about this is to divide up how we learn into 3 kind of buckets. So one is these recognition networks, and this is essentially how do we get the information? How do we get the material? And then there's strategic networks, so how can students interact with and express what they know, okay? And then there's the affective networks. This is how do we get students to be interested and motivated to learn, okay? And the overall goal here is for students to be lifelong learners who are truly engaged and interested in, whatever the topics are. It's not some grade outcome, right? It's a bigger picture outcome than that. And the result, if this is all implemented, is that students choose their own route to achieving a particular learning outcome, okay? Okay, so I've got some bullet points here, right? We want to improve their motivation, right? Make them truly excited to learn, activate their active learning, so get them involved with the material and valuing content knowledge, so make sure they value what they're learning. It's not just something that that they have to do, right? A box to be checked. And I'm seeking, as I teach organic chemistry, like a class that's required for a lot of students that they might not choose to take. Present information in a variety of ways, right? And this will benefit different types of learners. Offer multiple paths and materials to learn the content. Again, benefits multiple types of learners. And then also offer multiple means of expression or representation for each learning outcome. So this would be different options for a particular assessment. Okay, so first of all, I want to just kind of reflect, and we can discuss as well. So how can we apply these concepts to our own teaching? So we can think about how our students engage with material in our own courses. And before we do that, I think it's useful to think about how we learn our material, right? So how we interact with our own field. So identify some topic that you care about. It'll likely be maybe your field of research or a class that you teach, some topic that you care a lot about. So think about, how did you learn about it? How do you learn about it? How do you engage with it? How do you gauge your own understanding? Right? Do you write out multiple choice tests for yourselves and take them? Okay. And then what are your goals when you're learning about a topic? So I think if we can take some time to think about these things for ourselves, right? So we are in our field, we're doing it. I think that'll help, that at least helped me understand why it'd be important and aspirational to start making our courses more like this. So I don't know, I think we'll maybe save the breakout room for the second activity. So if you'd like, I can just pause the recording and folks can kind of share how you learn about your field or whatever it is that you picked, how you engage with it, how you gauge your own understanding. Are we comfortable doing that in the larger group? Yeah? Okay, I'll just, I'll pause the recording. Yeah, thanks so much, everyone. Yeah, Ed, go ahead.
So one thing that just raises to me is we tend to think about stating all these, like, what are the learning outcomes we want for our class, and we've been pushed to do that, I think, more so as things have changed. And so the question is, like, what do we want students to be able to do? And we tend to think it's not just memorize content, it's to be able to apply this stuff. And so how do we get a situation that allows enough autonomy that people can apply it? Maybe not to all the same thing, right? But to be able to show, like, you have your own autonomy to be able to do your own thing with it, but you can still demonstrate, so some coverage of it and stuff. And so that's what I've been struggling with in certain classes. If you have like assignments for them, I mean, how much you allow them to individuate them, but then they have the same requirements for it. But and then I think Simon's point is really well, like how you have to just explain it to other people or something like that, and that sort of gives you again a more of a sort of a sense of like how well you understand it, because if you can get other people to understand what you've done and analyzed and stuff, all the better. So I don't know.
Sure. Yeah, Simon.
Yeah, I was just going to follow on from what Ed said, because I think part of the dynamic that one would love to be able to change effectively is that instead of information going from the instructor to the student, the way in which it can go to the instructor to the student and create some circle of discourse among the students and the instructor. And doing that in a large classroom is challenging, let's say.
Absolutely. All right. Yeah, so I just have an example of a learning outcome and what it would look like if the students had choice versus if they don't, okay? And it's totally clear here that the role of the instructor, it's a lot more difficult to give the students choice. And this is like what we were saying, it can be hard to imagine how you might scale some of these things. On a small scale, I could see implementing a lot of these, but on a large scale, I think it would be more difficult and it would require a lot more creativity. Okay, and I'll try to address some of that just with my ideas, but I would love it if I could hear a few folks have ideas as well. Okay, so the learning outcome here that we're going to look at is students will analyze and critique scientific studies. Okay, so it's pretty broad. So if we think about engagement, if the students don't have a choice, everyone reads studies about vaccinations. Okay, if we do give them choice, let the students explore topics of interest and choose their own studies. Okay, so the instructor's role could be to discuss a variety of topics in class, give examples, encourage students to explore their interests. So that's engaging with the material, right? And then motivation. Right, then we look at representation. So if there's no choice, all students must read these 3 research-based journal articles. If we give them choice, students can use a variety of methods to access 3 studies, right? They might read the journal article, they might visit a website that explains it, they might look at a video of a conference proceeding, documentary, etc. And the instructor's role here is to guide the students in their research skills, okay, and provide resources and help them, figure out what's a good source and what isn't. And then for the expression, so what they do to show you that they got it, if there's no choice, everyone does an 8 to 10 page paper. If there is choice, students can create a project of their choice, so a video, broadcast, a brochure, a paper, a presentation, etc. And the instructor's role here is to make the expectations clear, right? So to provide a guideline and rubric that is flexible in terms of what the students will come up with, okay? So in a big class, I think, the way that we present the material, we can offer choices here. So, certainly our textbooks are vetted and we choose them because we like them for various reasons. And we can add, video content from the internet. It would have to be vetted, right? So this takes a lot of time. But we can include that in, here's your reading, or watch this, or do that, right? That's one way of kind of giving them choice in a large class. Representation, for this exact learning outcome, I think choice is the way to go, right? Because you want them to learn, you want to give them those library skills, right? So that the skills to find something to access. But again, it's going to take a lot more work on the part of the professor to help the students decide what's reasonable. And then expression, this becomes a lot more difficult on large scale especially when you're managing multiple graders, right, who are each grading their own sections, and you want to keep everything the same throughout. So, I think it's probably possible, and it just requires a lot of work. Does anyone else did any kind of, brilliant ideas pop in anybody's heads while you were thinking about this that you'd like to share? If not, we can move on. Okay, so that was just an example, right? Okay, so the activity that I had, and it's already 3 o'clock, so we can decide if Ed, you're shaking your head.
I think we're good. That's fine. We don't have to go through all those things later, so we're good.
Okay. So I was going to ask you to identify one learning goal from your course, right? So it could be something like what was on the last slide. So think about alternative ways that students can engage with a related topic, alternative ways that students can learn the specific material related to that learning outcome, and alternative assessments to gauge their understanding. So just to just give you a chance to kind of brainstorm. You don't have to solve this at this moment, but just to kind of come up with ideas with other folks. So Chris, if you'd put us back in our rooms, I'll put this on the Google Doc.
Will do. And since Josh just left, Tom, I'm going to punt you to room 1 so that they were balanced, okay? And
Can you see that? Okay, good. So we are nearing the end of our presentation here. So we are basically just going to go through a couple of things relatively quickly here to sort of try to wrap up a little bit of what the kind of goals of this whole workshop were, and maybe some suggestions about things we could do going forward that might be, again, actionable kinds of things. So the biggest thing at the beginning here, and I would like to just let anybody sort of interject at any point as we kind of go through these first couple things, is that, you know, we're trying to create an environment that satisfies some of these different abilities we want to create in the classroom, of having people engaged and being equal in terms of making everybody feel included and welcomed, et cetera. And so how do we do that in our classes? And we've already talked about some of the different struggles that we have in bigger classes as opposed to smaller classes. But, you know, one of the things I think that we all kind of struggle a little bit with is in situations where you have, you know, you're trying to get people to speak up, you're trying to get people to participate, et cetera, and you want them to ask questions and you want them to be engaged in the class. How do we do this in a way that not only encourages it, but also sort of fosters those different kinds of things we've talked about? So here's a list of some things that we've just identified that seem to be important things. There may be others, and so if people want to interject at any point at different points of ways of doing these successfully, or other things we need to keep in mind when doing it, but they're just some things I think that are in the spirit of what we've discussed. So just the idea that when people ask questions, I think that we know that not all questions are equal, but we have to treat everyone as important and valuable. So if it's a clarification question as opposed to something that's really insightful and stuff, we can't value some more than others. And I think that sort of creates an equanimity. Again, as an instructor, sometimes we don't know what somebody is really asking. It's not altogether clear, or maybe they're wrong about some particular concept. And so how do we do that without making somebody feel bad about getting something wrong or not articulating things very well? And so it just puts a burden of responsibility on us to, as much as possible, to be very respectful and patient about other people's questions, and to be able to try to, you know, figure out exactly what it is that they're trying to say, and to be very respectful, whether it's right, wrong, or just kind of a tangent or whatever, that it has some relevance to the material, and again, just respond to it in a more productive way than a dismissive way. So as it says here in the third one, you know, in a large classroom kind of setting, one of the issues we often have is, you know, we have X amount of material to get on. If you get off on tangents, how do you bring things back? And in any talk, that's always a challenge, right? I mean, that you want discussion, but you still know you kind of have to stay on a timeline, like right now. And so the question is, you know, how do you address questions in that way without being dismissive, but being able to sort of, again, respond to different kind of feedback or questions that you're getting in a way that is a way to sort of keep it within the parameters you're trying to do. So some of the things it says here are things like, you know, if somebody's a little bit off topic on different kinds of things, or they have a misconception, et cetera, to really try to say maybe, well, what I think you're saying is this, or that seems to relate to this. And so you can actually bring it back to something that you think that can relate to the entire class. But the important thing is just to, again, be respectful of the person asking it, to argue that it may be something other people are sharing, or it's related to some issues in the class, and to be able to bring it to a more productive kind of outcome, rather than just being dismissive or just kind of not knowing what to do with it. One of the things we talked about was in our groups earlier, was the idea of having different methods by which people could participate in discussions. And so, you know, the fact is, it's nice to have open-ended kind of discussions in class, et cetera, but some people aren't comfortable speaking up in that forum. Some people may, you know, again, you know, you just don't want to leave the freedom of somebody dominating discussions, et cetera. So maybe to have other kinds of tools by which people can participate, but don't make them self-conscious, just other methods. And so these are things, and we know that there's certain tools on Canvas and in other kinds of methods that we have to be able to have discussion boards. But question is, do we all have the time to do that? And do you have AIs or other people who you can assign that role of being able to monitor those things, so that the forums are there, but it's not so burdensome on the instructor to be able to constantly be monitoring that. And we talked about with the classroom norm stuff, right? I mean, what are the community norms and how quickly you get back to people, right? And the idea that like you can't necessarily always be responding in time. But another thing I think just in terms of thinking about those engagement issues and stuff is that, you know, I think I certainly fall into this trap, but sometimes when you're asking people for information, there is a right answer and you're searching for it and people have the opportunity to do it. But what do you do when somebody has an answer that isn't what you were looking for or isn't the right answer? And can you, again, make that something which isn't like, oh, well, you're wrong. And so that kind of maybe makes some people reluctant to speak up, or a situation where that's a positive thing, that's a learning experience, and we can really go with that. If somebody shared a kind of answer and, you know, people disagree, so obviously in situations where things are more based on opinion, or which is a good example of something, do you offer the opportunity for people to just, you know, potentially challenge each other and to potentially suggest an alternative kind of view? And again, how do you navigate that in a way which allows people to be free to speak, but doesn't single out somebody as being better or worse than somebody else, unless there is a legitimate kind of criteria by which we could judge, you know, the quality of answers. But as it says, you know, to really encourage people to be able to speak up if they get it wrong or they have some misconceptions, to use that to clarify things, and then to appreciate the fact that people are even speaking up and are willing to do that and are communicating things that everybody else is probably going to benefit from in general, and you can clear up misconceptions, etc. So, I mean, it's one of those kind of things I think that many of us struggle with in classes, to be able to do this. But when you overlay the kind of concerns about, you know, really trying to create the right environment in the classroom and to be inclusive and stuff, we just have to be, again, more vigilant about the fact that just our own behavior in those settings does convey a lot of information about value judgments. And are there separate people that we may be, you know, because they've given right answers in the past, I'll call on them more, or I'll go to them and defer to them. If people tend to be ones that, you know, tend not to give right answers or go off on tangents, I will kind of look for somebody else. And, you know, what are you conveying in that situation in terms of, you know, prioritizing the input of certain people as opposed to not? And so I think this is something just to keep thinking about. Do we create space for discussion, or do we avoid that? Do we have different exercises like a think, pair, share, where you have people, you know, communicating in smaller groups, not having to necessarily talk to the larger group, so you can have things break out into small things like a pair, or like we did with the groups of 3, and then somebody could be spokesman for the group, or these things can be shared in a Google Doc or some other kind of thing, which don't necessarily put somebody on the spot. So we just have 5 minutes remaining. So we're going to end with some scenarios, and I think we'll just review a couple of them, and then we can just sort of see which ones might be ones that, you know, we might want to try out and sort of think input wise about how we might apply some of this kind of knowledge in the context of what we've discussed. So the exercise here was give a scenario where potentially some bias or some kind of situation that might violate inclusivity might be here, and what would we do in response to that to try to rectify the situation? So let's begin with this one, where you're an instructor in an undergrad seminar and the class is discussion based, and you're trying to, you know, facilitate things but not intervene too much and stuff. And there are 2 students who tend to dominate the conversation, and both of them are male. And while they make good points, other students can't get the opportunity to speak up and voice their thoughts. What do you do? How do you sort of try to disrupt the monopoly on discussion time? How do you intervene while keeping the focus on the students rather than instructor guiding everything? So I think from this point, it's just like, it's a free for all. Anybody that has some ideas of how you might deal with this kind of situation, what would you do? And how do you avoid the issue Tom brought up, which was, how do you not alienate the males who are speaking up, but then give free rein for other people to be able to speak up in such situations? Anybody got suggestions of how to respond here?
I'm trying to think of how to Sorry, I should have raised my hand.
That's all good.
I'm trying to think of how to incorporate one of those alternative modes of discussion into this, like using a digital format instead of having to speak up.
Yeah.
And I know it says the instructor wants to minimize the amount of facilitation, but maybe that would help.
Yeah, Simon, you want to?
Yeah, I'm thinking about having experienced this in my discussion sessions, but I tend to play a more active role in the discussions where I'm circulating among the groups. And if one becomes aware of that, it's an opportunity to interrupt that group and ask other students within the group, well, what do you think about this? What do you think about this? And try and bring them into the conversation more. But that it requires an interaction, and I guess also one needs to have a classroom which enables one to recognize that that's what's actually occurring within those group discussions.
Yeah, one of the things that we talked about in our small group early on about the community norms was that whole idea of listening to other people too. And I think that sometimes, you know, when people are dominating conversations, they're not necessarily listening to anybody else. And then other people tune them out too, because, oh, there they are going on and dominating the discussion again. And so I think this is suggestions you're saying, Simon, of trying to make sure that people are listening to each other and then asking for a response to that. Do you agree? Do you not agree? I mean, any other opinions here or something like that that might defer it away from that might work, right? I mean, effectively in that situation. The only problem is that sort of the spirit of this is you want it to be student driven and not the instructor having to be like coach and monitor and stuff in this situation. And if you have to, you have to, but it would be nice if we could come up with ways. And I think, Ashley, the idea of getting it off from out loud kind of stuff, and maybe in other forums there might be better ways to be able to convey that stuff. Does anybody use Top Hat in their classes? And that's another thing that sometimes people do, where they're typing in stuff or they have polls and stuff to be able to get things in class which don't require as much of people talking out loud, but that's one thing I've seen. Okay. Well, I think since we're really up against 3:30, we could go through these other scenarios, and I'm just going to show you other ones that we've asked people to sort of think about. But this was one specifically. The next one about, you know, you have time for group work and somebody has the experience that's in a group kind of setting. The male students are laughing, a female student looks uncomfortable. You ask the student if everything's okay, and they say, you know, they're acting in a really sexist way and I don't really want to work with this group. And then what do you do? Right? Do you switch the group up? Do you, how do you, again, respond to that in a manner which will be most effective? And so, again, I think one of the things we have to sort of think about in these contexts is just if there are people who are showing some withdrawal responses or not feeling included, what things do we do to try to rectify those situations as much as possible and effectively do that?
I think this is a good plug for community norms.
Yeah.
Establish those first. You can point to it.
Yep. But do you switch them out of the groups? Or do you try to make the groups work?
I think if you do have a norm that's about respect and, you know, not treating people differently based on sex, then you can email people and say, you know, I've noticed that you may need to revisit this norm. Yeah, I don't know as far as addressing it in the classroom by like directly changing things, you might make the female student feel like she has caused a rift or something by doing that. And so,
right.
Yeah, it's a fraught situation.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and I think like the idea that you don't want to kind of impose yourself too much on the interactions as the instructor, just reminding the students that this is an agreement that you had with each other, then sort of relieves you of that. You're just pointing it out, you're reminding them, as opposed to saying, hey, these are my rules or something like that.
I mean, this gets back at the point that Josh was saying at the beginning, which is what's the value of like really going through this? And it's like to articulate those things and stuff, then you can reinforce them later. And if everybody's knowledgeable about them and they're not, you know, amorphous things that we're just assuming people get, or we don't really talk about them out loud, it's much harder to enforce anything later on because people aren't on the same page about it. So yeah, I think that really does reinforce the value of stating those things up front. Okay, with that said, I think we're up against 3:30. I know probably many of you, if not myself certainly included, and stuff have other things to do at this point, but we want to just appreciate the fact that people took the time to do this. Obviously, you know, thank you for joining us for this thing. One of the things that Olivia, who organized this event, would really appreciate is for those who attended to be able to fill out an evaluation to give us some feedback. As we said, the value of this, and we're always trying to learn from these experiences and move forward and make things better. We're certainly in that same ballpark. So we'd love to get feedback from you about your experience in this and ways that we could make these things more productive. Obviously, the sad thing is we could probably have spent a lot more time than we allotted for this, but we really appreciate you attending and participating. So with that, I'm going to adjourn and not share my screen.